Kuntsevo, the near Dacha, March 1st, 1953, 10:30 p.m. The lights are still on in Stalin's private dining room. They've been on since the previous night, when the most powerful man in the Soviet Union retired after a late dinner with 4 members of his inner circle. The blinds are drawn. The guards posted outside can hear nothing. The Dacha is surrounded by pine forest, cold and dark. The kind of darkness that swallows sound and secrets equally. Everything appears normal. Everything is as it always is at Kuntsevo, where Stalin has lived and worked for years, where the rhythms of the household are governed by a single rule. You do not disturb the general secretary unless he summons you. You do not knock on his door. You do not check on him. You wait. So, they wait. The guards rotate their posts. The kitchen staff sits idle. The telephones are quiet. And somewhere inside that private dining room, behind a closed door, Joseph Stalin is lying on the floor in a pool of his own urine, conscious but unable to move. A massive cerebral hemorrhage destroying his brain hour by hour while the most powerful security apparatus in the world stands 30 feet away and does absolutely nothing. This is the story of that night. A night of paralysis, of terror, of a system that had trained an entire nation to be afraid of one man and had trained the people closest to him to be most afraid of all. It's the story of Pyotr Lozgachev, a guard who found Stalin on that floor and carried the knowledge of what he saw for the rest of his life. A man who understood, with terrible clarity, that what happened at Kuntsevo that night was more than a dictator's death. It was the final proof that Stalin's real weapon wasn't guns or gulags or secret police. It was fear itself, a fear so absolute, so deeply embedded in everyone around him, that it paralyzed them even when their hesitation was killing him. To understand that night, you need to understand Kuntsevo. You need to understand what it was like to live and work in Stalin's shadow. The near Dacha at Kuntsevo, located about 10 kilometers west of Moscow, had been Stalin's primary residence since the late 1930s. After his wife Nadezhda's death in 1932, he'd largely abandoned the Kremlin apartments where she died and retreated to this complex of buildings set deep in carefully manicured grounds, surrounded by multiple perimeters of security. It wasn't a palace, not in the traditional sense. Stalin had simple tastes in his living environment: bare walls, functional furniture, a large dining room where he conducted much of his real business over long, alcohol-soaked dinners that lasted until dawn. The household staff at Kuntsevo occupied a strange, nightmarish position. They were among the most privileged people in the Soviet Union, with access to better food, better housing, and better pay than ordinary citizens. But they were also among the most endangered. To be close to Stalin was to be constantly under observation, constantly at risk of falling under suspicion. Previous members of his household staff had been arrested over the years, interrogated by the NKVD, accused of plotting against the general secretary on the basis of nothing more than a careless word or a reported conversation. The guards and servants at Kuntsevo lived with a constant background radiation of terror, a knowledge that any mistake could destroy them. Pyotr Lozgachev had been part of Stalin's security detail for years. He was a middle-ranking official in the guard service, reliable, professional, the kind of man the system valued, competent, discreet, unquestioning. He knew the rhythms of Kuntsevo intimately, the schedules, the procedures, the unwritten rules that governed every interaction with the general secretary. He knew, above all, the cardinal rule: you wait to be summoned. You do not approach Stalin uninvited. You do not open a door without permission. In the final years of Stalin's life, the atmosphere at Kuntsevo had grown progressively more tense. Stalin was 73 years old in 1953, physically deteriorating, though his mind remained sharp and suspicious. He suffered from arteriosclerosis, his blood pressure was dangerously high, and he'd been warned repeatedly by his doctors to reduce his workload, to drink less, to sleep regular hours. He ignored all of it. He kept his characteristic hours, sleeping during the day and working through the night, conducting his nocturnal business over the long dinners that his associates dreaded attending. These dinners were exercises in psychological torture. Stalin would invite members of his inner circle, men like Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin, and subject them to hours of drinking, crude jokes, and unpredictable mood swings. He'd show American westerns on a private cinema screen, then switch suddenly to discussing political matters of life and death importance. He'd force his guests to drink, watching them get drunk, then ask pointed questions and observe their answers. Every dinner was a test. Every response was being evaluated. The men who attended knew that their survival might depend on how they behaved at these events. In his final months, Stalin seemed to be preparing another purge. The doctor's plot, announced in January 1953, had accused a group of predominantly Jewish doctors of plotting to murder Soviet leaders. It was transparently a fabrication, but it echoed the Great Terror of the 1930s, suggesting Stalin was building toward another wave of arrests and executions. Members of his inner circle, particularly Beria and possibly Malenkov and Khrushchev, understood the pattern. They'd seen it before. The doctor's plot was the beginning, not the end, and each of them had reason to fear that the next wave of accusations might be directed at them. This background matters enormously for understanding what happened on March 1st, 1953, because the people who surrounded Stalin in his final hours were not just frightened servants. They were sophisticated political actors who had enormous personal stakes in what happened next, who understood that Stalin's death would fundamentally change the Soviet Union, and who may have had complex reasons for responding to his medical emergency in the way that they did. On February 28, 1953, Stalin invited 4 members of his inner circle to Kuntsevo for a dinner and film screening: Beria, Malenkov, Khrushchev, and Bulganin. According to all accounts, it was a typical evening. They watched a film, then moved to the dining room where they ate and drank until the early hours of March 1st. The atmosphere was reportedly relaxed by Kuntsevo standards. Stalin was in reasonably good spirits, though he'd been drinking heavily. At approximately 4 a.m., the guests said their farewells and departed. Stalin retired to his rooms. The household settled into its nighttime routine. What happened next depends on whose account you believe, but the broad outline is clear and consistent. The Dacha fell silent. Guards maintained their posts around the perimeter. No sound came from Stalin's private rooms. This was normal. Stalin often slept until noon or later. No one expected to hear from him until he rang for his morning tea, his standard signal that he was awake and required service. The hours passed. Morning became afternoon. The guards outside noticed nothing. The kitchen staff waited. The schedule at Kuntsevo was built around Stalin's whims, and if he slept late, everyone waited. This was routine, but by the evening of March 1st, concern began to build. Stalin had not rung. He had not called for tea, for food, for anything. The lights in his rooms were still on, had been on since the previous evening, but there was no movement visible through the blinds. Hours turned into a full day. No one called for him, no one checked. The standing orders were clear. Do not disturb the General Secretary. And those orders held even as the hours stretched into something that could no longer be explained by a particularly long sleep. According to Lozgachev's own later account, it was somewhere around 10 p.m. on March 1st, approximately 18 hours after Stalin had retired, that a reason finally presented itself to approach his rooms. Mail had arrived for Stalin, official correspondence that could justifiably require his attention. It was a pretext, thin but sufficient, something that gave a guard the technical grounds to approach the door without technically violating the standing orders. Lozgachev was the one who went. He gathered the mail, walked to Stalin's private rooms, knocked, and received no answer. He knocked again, louder. Nothing. He opened the door. What he found inside would stay with him for the rest of his life. Stalin was on the floor of the dining room, lying on a carpet near the table, wearing his pajamas. He was alive, but barely. His eyes were open, but his gaze was unfocused, wandering. He was making small sounds, not words, just sounds. One arm was raised slightly. His body was wet. He'd lost control of his bladder, possibly hours earlier. The most feared man in the world lay on his floor like a broken thing, helpless, unable to speak or rise. Lozgachev went to him immediately. He lifted Stalin, moved him to a couch, tried to make him comfortable. Stalin's eyes tracked him briefly, a moment of what might have been recognition, but he couldn't speak, couldn't communicate what had happened or how long he'd been there. Lozgachev's training told him this was a medical emergency. His entire body told him this was a medical emergency. What his experience and his profound, bone-deep fear told him was something more complicated. He needed to call for help. But calling for help at Kuntsevo wasn't like calling an ambulance anywhere else in the world. Decisions about Stalin's medical care required authorization from members of the inner circle. The guard service had to report to its superiors before taking action, and everyone at every level of the chain understood that making a wrong decision about Stalin's health could mean death. If you called doctors unnecessarily, and Stalin recovered and was furious at being disturbed, you could be shot. If you called the wrong people, you could be accused of conspiracy. If you delayed too long, you could be accused of negligence. Every option was dangerous. Lozgachev made calls. According to his account, he reached other members of the household staff and guard service, who immediately understood the gravity of what was happening. The calls moved up the chain. Within an hour, Stalin's immediate security supervisor had been reached. But reaching Beria and Malenkov, the political figures who had actual authority to summon doctors, proved harder. Or at least, it took longer than it should have. The accounts of the senior political figures vary in ways that have fascinated and disturbed historians for decades. According to Khrushchev's memoirs, he and the others were informed relatively quickly and came to Kuntsevo in the early hours of March 2nd. But Beria's response, according to multiple accounts, including Lozgachev's, was initially to suggest that Stalin was simply sleeping, that there was no need for alarm, that the guard shouldn't disturb the General Secretary over nothing. Whether this was genuine belief, deliberate delay, or something else entirely, it contributed to the paralysis that surrounded Stalin's medical emergency. Doctors were not actually summoned until the morning of March 2nd, nearly 10 to 12 hours after Lozgachev had found Stalin on the floor, and approximately 30 hours or more after Stalin had initially lost consciousness. The medical team that arrived were mostly junior physicians. The senior Kremlin doctors, including those who regularly treated Stalin, were under arrest as part of the doctors' plot. The very purge Stalin had been orchestrating had eliminated the most qualified people to treat him in his moment of crisis. The doctors who did arrive began treatment for what they identified as a massive stroke, a cerebral hemorrhage. Stalin was still alive, still occasionally conscious, but the damage was severe and irreversible. Over the next 3 days, his condition deteriorated, with brief moments of apparent consciousness, including one account of him raising his hand as if pointing at something, followed by deepening coma. He died on the evening of March 5, 1953. Lozgachev was present through much of this. He helped care for Stalin in his final hours, assisting the medical team, maintaining his post, observing everything. He watched the senior political figures come and go, Beria appearing confident and assertive, already behaving like a man who knew power was shifting. Khrushchev weeping, whether from genuine grief or political calculation, is impossible to know. Malenkov quiet, watchful. He saw Stalin's children summoned. Vasily, drunk and incoherent, shouting that his father had been murdered. Svetlana, composed but devastated, sitting beside the bed, holding her father's hand in his final hours. And then Stalin died, and Pyotr Lozgachev, the man who'd found him, who'd lifted him from the floor, who'd spent 3 days watching the final hours of the Soviet Empire's absolute ruler, went home. And he said nothing publicly for decades. This is perhaps the most remarkable part of his story. Lozgachev lived through the post-Stalin political upheaval, Beria's arrest and execution, Khrushchev's rise and fall, Brezhnev's long stagnation, Gorbachev's reforms. He lived through the Soviet collapse, and throughout all of it, he kept his silence. He gave no interviews. He published no memoirs. He answered no journalists' questions. He was as invisible as a man can be. Why? The answer requires understanding what it meant to be a witness to something so politically sensitive in the Soviet system. What Lozgachev had seen was potentially explosive. He'd seen the delay in treating Stalin. He'd seen the behavior of the senior leadership in those critical hours. He knew the timeline, knew who was called and when, knew details that contradicted or complicated the official narrative. In the Soviet system, that knowledge was dangerous. Not because anyone had explicitly threatened him, but because the system itself trained people to understand that certain knowledge was lethal. He'd also taken an oath. His entire career was built on discretion, on the understanding that what happened at Kuntsevo stayed at Kuntsevo. To speak publicly would have been a profound violation of everything his professional identity was built on. And for what? To tell a story that might contradict the official version, that might implicate powerful people, that might make him the target of political retaliation. The risks were enormous. The benefits were unclear. The silence was safer. There's also the question of what he actually believed about that night. Lozgachev later said, in the accounts he eventually did give, that he was simply following established procedure, that the delay was a product of the system, of the rules that governed every interaction with Stalin. He didn't describe himself as having made a decision to delay. He described himself as having been paralyzed by a situation that the entire structure of Soviet power had made impossible to navigate safely. He was a man trapped in a system of rules designed for impossible circumstances. But historians who've studied his accounts note the gaps, the careful omissions, the moments where his narrative seems to glide past certain questions without quite engaging them. Did he notice signs of distress from Stalin's rooms earlier than he admitted? Did the senior leadership know sooner than they acknowledged? Was there discussion among the guards, among the political figures, about what to do and when to do it that hasn't been fully captured in any account? These questions remain open because Lozgachev chose, for most of his life, not to answer them. When he did eventually speak, in interviews given in the 1990s after the Soviet collapse, when the political risks had diminished significantly, his account was careful, measured, and consistent with the broader historical record in its broad outlines. He described finding Stalin on the floor, described his immediate response, described the process of notifying superiors, described the arrival of the doctors. He described it all with the flat, precise language of a professional, a man recounting events with the careful neutrality of someone who understood that his words would be analyzed and scrutinized. What he conveyed most powerfully, whether intentionally or not, was the atmosphere of that night. The fear. The way that every person at Kuntsevo, from the lowest guard to the most senior official, was paralyzed by a single question. What if I make the wrong decision? What if calling the doctors is wrong? What if not calling them is wrong? What if this is a test? What if Stalin recovers and is furious? What if Stalin dies and someone needs to be blamed? In a system where every action was potentially treasonous, inaction felt like the safest choice. And inaction, over the course of a long and terrible night, may have cost Stalin the hours that could have saved him. The irony is devastating and almost too on the nose. The system Stalin had spent decades building, the system of absolute authority and absolute terror, the system that had trained everyone around him to be afraid of their own judgment, that system killed him. Not a conspiracy, not an assassin, not a political rival with a gun, just fear. Just the ordinary, rational, survival instinct fear of men and women who'd learned that in Stalin's Soviet Union, the wrong decision meant death. Lozgachev understood this. He'd lived it. He'd felt it in his own body in the moment he stood before Stalin's closed door, holding a stack of mail, trying to find the courage to knock. He knew that what happened that night wasn't just about medical decisions or political calculations. It was about the logical endpoint of totalitarianism. When you build a system where everyone is afraid of the man at the top, the day will come when that man needs help, and everyone will be too afraid to help him. Stalin had created Kuntsevo as a fortress against the world. He'd surrounded himself with loyal guards, vetted staff, multiple security perimeters. He'd eliminated doctors he didn't trust and jailed the ones he did. He'd made it impossible for anyone to approach him without his explicit permission. And in doing so, he'd created the perfect conditions for his own death. Alone, on a floor, for hours. While 30 feet away, people who could have saved him stood frozen, terrified of making a mistake. Pyotr Lozgachev died in relative obscurity. He was never famous, never sought fame. He gave his interviews, told his story in the careful, limited way he'd chosen, and returned to his private life. But the story he told, the story he carried for decades in silence, is one of the most revealing documents of the Stalin era, more revealing, perhaps, than any political memoir or historical analysis, because it shows us the system not from the top, not from the perspective of the dictators and generals and political strategists, but from the floor level, from the perspective of a man on his knees beside a fallen tyrant, trying to decide if helping him is safe. Today, the Kuntsevo Dacha still exists, hidden among the pine trees west of Moscow. It's been used for various government purposes over the years, and it's not regularly open to the public. The rooms where Stalin lived and worked, the dining room where he spent his last conscious evening, the corridor where Lozgachev walked with that stack of mail, they're still there, preserved in something like amber. The carpet where Stalin fell has been replaced, presumably. The furniture is different, but the layout is the same. The distances are the same. If you stand in that space and think about what Lozgachev described, about the silence that stretched for 18 hours, about a man lying on the floor while the world continued to revolve around the assumption of his invincibility, it says everything about power and its illusions. Stalin was never invincible. He was never omnipotent. He was a man, a damaged, paranoid, cruel man who built a machine of control so total that it couldn't even function when he needed it most. And Lozgachev, the last man to find him alive, the man who held this story inside himself for decades, understood something that historians have been trying to articulate ever since. That the most dangerous thing in a totalitarian system isn't the dictator. It's the fear he creates. The fear that outlasts him, that shapes every decision of every person around him, that in the end turns the most powerful system ever constructed into a room full of people staring at a closed door, afraid to knock. The last man to see Stalin alive spoke eventually. But what he said, what he couldn't quite bring himself to fully say, what exists in the spaces between his careful words, is perhaps the most important testimony of all. Not about what happened to Stalin, but about what Stalin did to everyone around him. What fear does to human beings when it becomes absolute, when it seeps into every decision, every reflex, every instinct. Joseph Stalin died on March 5th, 1953. He was 74 years old. He died surrounded by the system he'd built, protected by the guards he'd trained, tended by the doctors he hadn't yet managed to have arrested. He died in a country that would go on existing for another 38 years, carrying the weight of what he'd done, what he'd built, what he'd destroyed. And somewhere in Moscow, a man named Pyotr Lozgachev went home, took off his uniform, sat down, and began the long work of deciding how much to say and how much to carry alone for the rest of his life. He chose silence for decades, and in that silence perhaps is the truest monument to what Stalin created. A world where even the truth was too dangerous to speak, where a man who'd done nothing wrong, who'd done everything he could, still spent 40 years wondering if he'd made the right decision in a moment when there was no right decision to make. That's the final lesson of Kuntsevo. Power that rules through fear doesn't end when the fearful man dies. It ends slowly, in whispers and half-told stories, in interviews given cautiously decades later, in the gradual, painful process of a society learning to speak again after years of enforced silence. Lozgachev's eventual testimony was part of that process, a small part, a quiet part, but a true one. And truth in the Soviet Union was always worth waiting for.